Hi again, everybody. Peggy McGuire here for English 106, Written Business Communication. Today's topic, we're going to step back a bit and talk about the process of writing. And we're going to look at the key research-based steps, or I guess I should say components, of a writing process that is most likely to get us the best and most effective written communication at the end of the day. And so we'll look at the writing process in general, what it is composed of, but then we'll also go then and look at what that writing process looks like specifically when you are doing written business communication. And finally, we will do a little uh, reminder of information about memos, because that's going to be your first graded written assignment, is to do some memos. So we'll go back and just do a little reminder about using the writing process to produce good memos. All right, so let's get started. So writing as a process. Now, this may seem obvious, and yet for a long time I think people thought about writing as product. It's the thing that you produce. And in fact, in order to produce that piece of text, there is a whole mental process that goes on before, during, and after we draft any piece of text, no matter what its purpose. And certainly that's true in business writing. So there are a couple of important big picture issues here, that what we know about how things work in the world of writing. One of them is that we know that if you want to write better, you need to write more, and you need to write regularly. We do not improve our writing skills unless we write regularly. So just right off the bat, you want to be keeping in mind that you need to keep yourself in practice to stay nimble as a writer. You need to write on a regular basis to be a good writer. The second thing, true and certainly foundational to the writing process, is the first thing that I draft is never going to be perfect. Great writers don't publish their first drafts. First drafts are not supposed to be perfect. They're supposed to be a place to start, a place from which we improve until our message is exactly as we want it to be. Okay? And then the products of writing, once we go through the writing process, will always be stronger if we as writers do a few things. First of all, this shouldn't surprise anybody, if we have a clear goal in mind for our writing. In other words, if we are aware of our own writing purpose. There is purpose again. Always there. A good writer knows what I want to accomplish by writing, and thinks about that and lets that guide me. I'm always guided by reminding myself of what I'm trying to accomplish, what my goal is. I keep bringing that up to myself as a way to guide what I write and the choices I make about my writing. And if I'm a good writer, not only am I clear about why I'm writing, but I then have a number of strategies available to me to achieve my writing goal or my writing purpose. So I've got the clear idea of what I want to accomplish, but I've also got the tools to accomplish it. And the more I write, the more I learn, the more tools I develop, so that I have lots of strategies and I know how to use lots of strategies for achieving my writing goal. All right. I use rules as guidelines for what I write. So in other words, that means I have to know the rules, and I use them. I don't get fixated on them, but I use them as I need to guide me, to make sure that I'm making the best choices about how to write. And because first drafts are never perfect, my drafts come first, and then I start editing. So I allow myself to get stuff out on the paper or on the computer screen, but I see that again as only the first step, because then I start changing and improving what I've written so that it gets to be the best message possible. So drafting and editing are key parts of this process. So speaking of key parts of the process, here they are. Here are the key components of the writing process. And number one, planning. I would hazard to say that if you do a good enough job and you spend enough time planning what you're going to write before you ever put down anything in a draft, if you spend the time, you are going to do such a better job. First of all, if you spend good time planning, the drafting is going to be much easier, but it's also going to be much more advanced, and the less work you'll have to do afterwards to fix it. So I strongly suggest that you think of planning as a considerable bulk of the job of writing. Okay, so what do I mean by planning? Well, this should not surprise you. The first two pieces, attending to my writing purpose, being really clear with myself about what I want to accomplish by writing, what my goal is here. And then attending to audience, to the people who are going to read my writing. Who am I trying to reach? Why am I trying to reach them? What do I know about them? What do they need? What do they want? What do they expect? All the things we've talked about before and will continue to talk about. So a big piece of planning is continually coming back to purpose and audience. All right. So if I do that, if I'm guided by a clear sense of my writing purpose and as clear as possible understanding of my writing audience, then there are two ways that I can use writing in the planning process before I even draft anything. And that is what I like to call writing to think, which means generating ideas to write about. Let me say that it feels to me, in my experience, that this is the part of the planning process that so and most often gets skipped over for some reason. Maybe we're so focused on getting a product created that we forget that we need to think about what we want to say before we start saying it. And sometimes we need some time to really come up with what we want to say in writing. So we can use writing as a way to actually get out possible ideas before we decide on what those ideas are going to be. And this is where things like their strategies like brainstorming, like free writing, and there are lots of others, ways that you actually get ideas out without censoring yourself, without editing, without correcting, just allowing yourself to think about what you want to say. And when it comes to more complex kinds of writing, allow yourself to think about what you know about the topic that you're going to be writing about, but also what you don't yet know and what you need to find out. So part of writing to think is doing the kind of research that you might need to do to create additional information to bring together and put into that pot. Think of it as a great big pot and you're throwing ideas into it that you may or may not use, but you're trying to get them all out into that pot so you have a nice big full pot of ideas and information that you can then work with. That's what writing to think is about, getting the ideas out before we decide on how to use them. All right? Again, it's often skipped over, but if you skip over it, by the time you get to our next piece, the thinking to write, which is organizing your ideas, you don't have anything to organize. You need to have something to organize. You need to have the ideas out there. You need to have the information that you found by talking to other people or by doing library research or by interviewing or however you're going to get information that might go into your writing. Get the ideas first, and then we move to the fourth piece, which is thinking to write, which means you take those ideas now and you start deciding what you're going to do with them. And this is a place where you might have some that you don't use at all. Or you might realize that you need some more. And then you go back and do a little more generating ideas. But what you're doing is now starting to organize those ideas. And that's where some people like to use outlines. Or if you are more visually inclined, using more graphic organizers like mind maps or webs or spider webs. And again, there are all kinds of ways to organize what you write depending on what kind of writing you need to do and how you're going to produce it. So, but you can't organize things that you don't have yet. So make sure that you give yourself the time to get the ideas out and have lots of ideas before you start trying to organize them. All right? That's when the tools like graphic organizers and outlines come in handy, but only when you have information to work with, when you've generated the ideas. So make sure that that's a part of your planning process. So you can see this is a big piece of the writing process. You're really doing a lot of the work already to think about what you're going to write and how you're going to organize it. That's a lot of work. And if you do it well and you spend the time on it that you need, you're probably going to do a much better job when it comes to drafting. So those conventions goes back to grammar, sentence structure, spelling, and punctuation, etc. Now we're going to take what we know about them and we're going to do what's usually called proofreading or editing. Those are the terms we use for the kinds of changes that are more about the mechanics, like spelling, punctuation, grammar, those kinds of things. That's another kind of revising. So when we talk about revising a draft, we are talking about two different ways of thinking about it, both of which are extremely important to if I'm going to reach my reader and tell my reader what I need them to know. All right? So improve your writing by making sure it says what you want it to say, but improve your writing by also making sure that it's clean and error-free so that your reader can read it and understand it without struggling to get your meaning. Okay? So, that's the big picture. That's the writing process, which is the result of years of research about how good writers write and what good writers do to produce good writing. All right? So now let's put it into the context of written business communication. So when I'm talking about planning in written business communication, here are the kinds of things I'm doing. I'm looking at the problem that I need to solve. Remember problem solving? I'm looking at the question that needs to be answered. I'm looking at the issue that needs to be addressed. Right? I'm thinking about it, making sure I'm clear on what my purpose is. Right? That's how I get to my purpose, by being really clear about the problem itself, about the issue itself, about the question to be answered. And then saying, okay, so my purpose in writing here is to answer the question and to resolve this issue, to address this problem. All right? Once again, you're going to be really sick of this, but it's right. Purpose goes with audience. So I define my purpose and then I analyze my target audience. Who do I need to get this message to? Who are they? What do they need? What do they want? What do they already know? What do they need to know? How can I best reach them? Okay? So, I look at purpose, I look at audience, and now I think about the information that I need to include in my message. That's the planning piece where I'm brainstorming information, I'm gathering information, I'm getting all the information I need, and then I start organizing it, right? Um, and that starting of organizing could be as simple as getting some of those ideas into words, making lists, making possible headings, taking notes, free writing, whatever it is to help me generate information that's going to go in the message, and then start thinking about how to organize that information. And this at this point, because I'm looking carefully at the information I already have, I may realize that I need to gather more information. So where am I going to get it from? I'm thinking about, do I get it from other people? Do I have to find some printed materials? Are there websites I can use? Am I replying to a message that has information that I need to repeat? Um, Again, we are still in planning before we draft anything in order to have as much information as possible available to us to respond to whatever problem or issue we are writing about. Still on planning. I've got all the information. Now what I say is, all right, what's going to be the main point I want to make to my reader? In other words, another way of saying this, what's my thesis? Although we won't use that word a lot, we don't tend to use it a lot in business writing. But the fact is, you need to come up with a primary point, a main idea that you want to communicate to the reader. And then selecting the information from all that information that I gathered, selecting what information will support that main idea, that main point that I want to get across to my reader. And then choosing which organizational pattern will best be used to make my point. Are we talking about a memo here? Are we talking about a letter, a report, a proposal? And are we primarily informing, or are we trying to persuade somebody of something? So you're thinking about the channel, the kind of writing to do based on why I'm writing, what my writing purpose is, and what main point I want to make. Now I can organize. The final piece of the planning is now I can organize this piece of writing. I can make an outline, or I create a list. I can draw a web or a map, because that's what's going to guide my draft. All right. That's, once again, it should be clear just from how much there is to say about it, that the planning is huge. And if you take it seriously, you're doing a great deal of your work before you ever draft. All right? So if you've planned well, you've already done a lot of your writing. So you create rough drafts, you develop subsequent drafts for external audiences. All right? So as soon as that external audience starts coming into view, you're going to be doing something different than the rough draft just for you. Right? You're going to start thinking about correctness and content more as soon as you start thinking about your external audience. All right, so you've done the planning, you've done an excellent job of the planning, you've drafted something. Now it's time to go and make that something be what you want it to be, to make it the strongest possible conveyor of your message. So here again, we think about revising in two different ways. We think about it first as revising the content, the meaning of your message. That means you are reading your text and evaluating it, looking at it, measuring it against what you wanted to accomplish, my purpose. What's required of the task, what I have to do in order to meet my purpose. What does my audience need? Are they getting it in this written document? What about my planning materials? Let me go back to my outline. Let me go back to my pot full of ideas and make sure I didn't miss anything or forget anything. Does the text say, at the end of the day, does this text say what I want it to say? And does it say it clearly? Does it say it convincingly? Is my main point clear? Is what I am asking right out there and convincing? Right? That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about revising for content, the kinds of questions I ask myself about the text that I just wrote and that I am now reading over. Then the next level is to go get feedback from somebody else. But you're still asking the same questions. You hand that paper to someone else, you still want to know the same things. You want that person to tell you, is my purpose clear here? Does this piece of writing meet all the requirements that I had to meet? Does it reach my audience? Does it seem like what I wrote is taking the needs of my audience into account? That's what you want to ask other people as well as yourself. Right? And then, based on your own assessment of what you wrote and the feedback you get from someone else, then you will add, or you'll delete, or you'll rearrange, or you'll substitute text based on what you now know about what worked and what didn't work, what was strong and what wasn't so strong, right? Because you took the time to read it over and think about it, about the content. And hopefully you also got feedback from someone else. That's why we do peer review. That's why I will look at your writing and make comments on it and give it back to you before you do a final draft, so that you have several opportunities to get feedback from somebody else, and which you then can use to add, delete, rearrange, substitute in order to improve your overall text. Now, no one is holding a gun to your head to do that. You get feedback, and then you as the writer are in control of whether or not or how you use that feedback. But I assure you, if you use feedback, you will come up with a better, stronger document. Revision number 2. So that's what we're talking about, content. Now we're talking about the surface, the writing conventions, the mechanics, the correctness. Okay? They are really surface features. Nevertheless, they're very important to the readability of your document. So, your task is also to go over, look for, and correct any spelling or mechanical errors. Check your word choice to make sure that you are maintaining that formal, businesslike, but friendly and positive tone, and that you're not using language that is offensive to anyone, right? Or language that is not appropriate to the audience or the context. So you're checking your own choice of words. You're checking the format. Does your text follow the rules? If it's a memo, does it have everything in it that a memo needs to have? If it's a business letter, does it have all the parts of it that a business letter needs to have? If it's a report, does it have the correct headers? Does it have the table of contents? Does it have all the pieces that go into it that are surface features that aren't about the meaning, but they are nevertheless important to the readability and accessibility of your text? And typographical errors. So frustrating. It's so relatively easy to get rid of typographical errors if you just take the time to read your text. And one of the things I suggest is reading it out loud. It's amazing how we can catch our own small fixable errors by reading out loud. But in any case, please take the time to get rid of typographical errors. They're just inexcusable in business communication. And because what they indicate is a lack of respect for the audience, and also just a laziness on the writer's part, an inability or unwillingness to just take the time to make something look good, to look formal and professional. And that feels insulting to your audience. I promise you. So take the time to do it. You will benefit greatly by doing that. Okay? Good. Now, here is just this quick and dirty reminder about business memos, because You're going to be now using that process that we just talked about every time, I hope, every time you are tasked with developing some kind of written product in this class or anywhere else. So, how are we going to use that planning, drafting, and revising process when we write business memos? Well, let's first think about the audience and purpose of business memos. All right? So business memos are designed to be used internally. So the purpose of a business memo is going to be to communicate some information within an organization or company. So other people in the same company or organization. So that's going to always be the broad purpose of a memo. All right. Now, in today's workplace, most of those memos end up being emails. So business emails are basically electronic forms of business memos, and they take the same format. All right. And here we just have this nice little chart to remind us about the components of business memo as opposed to a letter, which we will come to later. So let's just look at the business memo piece of it. It's going to be brief. Its purpose is going to be either to inform people about something or to persuade them to do something. Again, it's usually used internally. It's very, very rare that you would send an email memo outside of the company to try to conduct some kind of business. Very rare. So these are internal documents. That's the broad purpose, to communicate, either to inform or to persuade internally within an organization. And your audience, therefore, are going to be other employees who need to know about some decision that's been made, some policy, some procedure, some action. All right. So there's your purpose and audience that you keep in mind through your planning process to guide what you're going to say. Then when it comes to organizing the information, you focus on the key components of a business memo. So make sure that when you are ready to organize the information that you've collected and thought about and decided to use, that you have your from line, that's you, the sender, your to line, whoever you're writing to, your CC line, if you intend for someone else to see the message, then you put that someone else's name, email address into the CC line. The subject line, I've said this before and I'll say it again, the subject line is really critical. You need to pay attention to it and spend some time coming up with a really good subject line, because that subject line has to concisely and specifically convey what the memo or email is about. I say that because I know that I delete emails if the subject line doesn't interest me or if it's blank. I don't read it if I don't think I'm going to care about it. Well, how do I know whether or not I care enough to keep going? I know by the subject line. The subject line tells me something about the importance of the message. All right. So you want that subject line to specifically and concisely say what the purpose of this memo is, so that I read it and I say, okay, I'm going to continue reading. All right. Memos also may contain attachments if they're in email form, or what we call enclosures with memos. All right. So you may have to enclose additional documents with a memo or attach additional documents on an email. Then the body of the memo, you got a good subject line now, so I won't be surprised by the body. I know what to expect, or I know something of what to expect. So the body may or may not contain a direct greeting to the reader. Again, the body needs to be short, clear, and appropriate. Say what you need to say. Don't need to play around. get the message out as clearly as possible. And then the memo ends with your signature block, which includes your name, your title, and your best contact information. So, just wanted that as a quick reminder, and everything we've just said, what I've just said about memos, is the kind of thinking that you would do in the planning part of the writing process. Because now, if you plan that all out, you're ready to write and you've got half the battle done. Okay? So, onward to our next topic, and talk to you soon.